Welcome to the July 24th, 2014 Murfreesboro City Council. Councilman Gilly has our prayer and our pledge.
Thank you, Mayor. If you bow with me, please. Dear God, our most loving Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day and all the many blessings that you bestowed upon us. We thank you for this great city and country in which we live, and for those that fight daily to protect the freedoms that you have given us. Father, be with them and their families. Be with us tonight as we make decisions for this city, and give us your wisdom. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gilly. You have your consent agenda before you. Have several items on there. If you have any questions?
Hearing none, I'll move to approve.
Second.
All right, Mr. LaLance, Mr. Washington. Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gales-Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. You have the minutes of the June 26th meeting, the July 10th public comment meeting, and the July 10th regular meeting in front of you. If you see any additions or deletions. All right, seeing none, we'll have a motion, please.
If none, I move for approval.
Second.
Ms. Gales-Harris, Mr. LaLance, Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gales-Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. On third reading, we'll consider for passage on third and final reading ordinance 14OZ25 to rezone an area located along Wilkinson Pike to mixed-use MU district.
Move for passage.
Second.
Mr. Smotherman, Mr. Washington. Ms. Wright, you'll call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gales-Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. You have some information on your desk that is pertaining to item 4. Make sure everyone has that.
Mayor, in addition, I think we all got an email today of a letter regarding ownership status of the center monument that Ms. McGannon, were you copied
I was.
on that? And I think separate and apart from what we're doing here tonight, that's an issue that will probably need to be looked at between the city and its status of that monument.
Well, whether or not the city has any interest in transferring the city-owned median is something that staff certainly can look at and make a recommendation to the Planning Commission, which would then bring the matter back to the City Council.
But that would have to be done separately from what is
Yes, sir.
occurring now. Okay.
Okay. All right, we'll consider for passage on third and final reading ordinance 14OZ27, amending an area of Indian Hills PUD to be used for a restaurant along South Church Street at Calumet Trace.
Move for passage.
Second.
Mr. Smotherman, Mr. Washington, Ms. Wright, you'll call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
No.
Ms. Gales-Harris.
Yes.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. We'll consider for passage on third and final reading ordinance 14OZ28 to amend a PRD at Stratford Hall located along Old Lascassas Highway by removing approximately 1.14 acres and zoning as a separate PRD.
Move for passage.
Second.
Mr. LaLance, Mr. Washington, Ms. Wright, will call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gales-Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. We'll move to second readings and consider for passage on second reading ordinance 14OZ36 to rezone an area along Agra Park Drive to residential multifamily 16, RM16 district.
Move for approval.
Second.
Mr. Young, Mr. LaLance, call the roll, please.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gales-Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Consider for passage on second reading ordinance 14OA37 to annex an area along Veterans Parkway and to adopt for same a plan of services. Ms. Kathy Wright, executor of Bess Hartman Estate, applicant 2014-504.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Gilly, Mr. Young. Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Pass.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Consider for passage on second reading ordinance 14OZ38 to zone an area along Veterans Parkway as planned commercial development PCD district simultaneous with annexation.
Move for passage.
Second.
Mr. Smotherman, Mr. Young. Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Pass.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Consider for passage on second reading ordinance 140839 to annex an area located along Veterans Parkway and to adopt for same a plan of services.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. LaLance, Mr. Young. Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Consider for passage on second reading ordinance 14OZ40 to zone an area along Veterans Parkway as highway commercial CH district simultaneous with annexation.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Gilly, Mr. LaLance. Ms. Wright, if you'll call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington. Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Consider for passage on second reading ordinance 14OZ41 to amend an area in the Plan Unit Development PUD district located north of Franklin Road, Old Fort Parkway in the Hampton Park at Hillwood PUD.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. LaLance, Mr. Gilly, Ms. Wright, will call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Yes.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. We'll move into new business and consider recommendation of the Planning Commission with regards to scheduling a public hearing to consider sign ordinance amendments 2014-804 for signs on single buildings on single lots with single tenants in PCD, PID, and PUD, and within the GDO 1, GDO 2, GDO 3, and GDO 4 overlay districts. Mr.
Thank you,
Ayla.
Mayor, members of the council. During its regular meeting on July 9th, the Plan Commission conducted a public hearing on the matter that you just described. After the public hearing, the Plan Commission discussed the matter and then recommended its approval. These are amendments to the sign ordinance, and we need to schedule it for a public hearing.
Ms. McGannon, you have a
Mayor,
date?
I would suggest August 21st.
August 21st. How does that look to everyone?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Ms. Wright, you'll call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Aylock. And we also have a joint meeting with the Planning Commission that night, correct?
Yes, sir. 5 p.m. There'll be a joint special meeting between the Planning Commission and City Council to kick off the comprehensive plan.
Okay. Okay, we'll consider number 13, consider renaming Westview Mini Park to Gladys Blanton Park.
Mayor, I guess I can speak to that very briefly. We did some research on the name of the Westview Mini Park, and we've been contacted to see if the name of that park could be renamed to the Gladys Blanton Park. Ms. Blanton served in that part of our community for many, many years, well known in that part of our city. She started her career with the city of Murfreesboro in 1958. And she served as a school crossing guard. She retired in 2009 after 45 years of service. Most of her service was in front of McFadden Elementary, so many people in our community have seen Ms. Blanton, and the suggestion was to rename that park after her. She's lived in that community for 68 years.
And I believe also her sons had worked with the fire department, one who passed away this past year was a firefighter for many years.
Yeah, Donnie and Mike.
1958 was a really good year, and I'll move for passage.
All right, Mr. Smotherman, who had the second?
Mr. Washington.
Mr. Washington had the second. All right.
Mr. Gelly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Consider recommendations of the Deputy Fire Chief to terminate the contract with Verde Inc., low bidder for construction of enclosed fire investigation trailer, and approve the contract with Mortuary Response Solutions, Trailer Logic, second lowest bid for fire investigation trailer. Deputy Chief Toombs.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Council and City staff. It's the recommendation of the City Council to terminate the city contract with Verde Incorporated as the lowest bidder of the arson investigation trailer and award the contract to the second lowest bidder, Mortuary Response Solution Trailer Logic. In September 2013, MFRD was awarded a FEMA Fire Prevention and Safety Grant. The grant was 80% federal funded and 20% local match required. The federal share is $28,000. The city share is $7,000. MFRD utilized a competitive bid process, and on May 15, 2014, City Council awarded Verde Incorporated the lowest bidder for the project. Amount of the bid was $32,995. Per a contract signed by Verde Incorporated on May 23, 2014, they agreed to deliver the trailer in 120 days. 5 days later, the company came back and said it would be 125 days. On June 2, 2014, Verde sent an initial draft of the CAD drawing. On June 9th, Assistant Fire Marshal Michael Bartlett and a representative from Verde had a phone conversation in which they discussed revision to the trailer design. The city did not receive the revised drawing until July 2nd and was informed on July 9th that the company would not be able to meet the 125-day requirement. The company rep said the drawing was sent mid-June, but the city IT department searched the archives and could not substantiate the claim. Due to the change in performance schedule, we submitted an amendment to FEMA requesting an extension period of performance for this grant. Also, because the planned revision were not met with the new CAD drawing in a timely manner, we no longer consider Verde to be a responsible bidder. For this reason, we recommend terminating the contract with Verde and accepting the second lowest bid for Mortuary Response Solution Trailogic in the amount of $36,554.90. which is over budget by $1,554.90. We will absorb the overage through saving in the department budget. Also, this afternoon we received from FEMA, they approved our request to give us a 3-month extension to December 6, 2014. I'll try to answer your question if you have some.
You have any questions?
If there are no questions or comments, I move that we accept.
Second. Ms. Gels Harris. Mr. LaLance. Ms. Wright, will call the roll.
Mr. Gelly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. Thank you, Deputy Chief Toombs. Item 15, we'll consider revisions to the employee handbook. Ms. McGann.
Mayor and members of the council, we have 2 important city policies to bring to you tonight. I'll talk about them and ask you to adopt them separately. The first is to revise Section 1004 of our employee handbook, which deals with the Family and Medical Leave Act. As you know, that's a federal statute which the city has been following for a number of years. There have been a number of changes to it and to the regulations, particularly providing military qualifying exigency leave and military caregiver leave. We've been doing that, but we hadn't modified the employee handbook section. There have been 2 sets of regulations, and we thought it was time to go ahead and do that. However, in structure, we are pruning, if you will, what we're trying to achieve in the policy, recognizing that so much of this is going to be fact-specific. It's really going to depend on interaction between the Human Resources Department staff and the employee. So we're not trying to put all of the intricacies into the policy. I think members of the council were wise in not accepting my invitation to get your very own copy of the more than 70 pages of regulations to read in advance of your consideration of the policy. We are, however, making two changes I want to call to your, recommending two changes I want to call to your attention. The first is making explicit the method by which the FMLA plan year is calculated. We are not making a change, but we are in closer compliance with the regulations and being explicit about how this is being done. Because the regulations say you're supposed to give 60 days advance notice to employees before you make a change, and the changes, we're making it more clearly defined, we're asking you to approve this one with an effective date of October 1st. We're going to use that period of time to give notice to the employees, as well as to make some procedural changes in order to identify employees who may be absent from work from FMLA qualifying reason sooner. We hadn't been having HR involved as promptly as we intend to do going forward to make sure that all employees are notified of their rights and that the different forms which are applicable get to them at the earliest possible date, and that they have a prompt response obligation equally. Second, we're proposing to make a change that will get us more in conformity with what other cities do and what's deemed to be best practice, and that is to call for paid leave to be used when someone is on FMLA leave. The federal law says that it is unpaid. It doesn't require pay, but it allows the employee to use paid leave in circumstances, and it allows the employer to require the use of paid leave. We are recommending that we not do which most do, which is to require all paid leave be used before any unpaid leave can be used. We thought it important to allow employees to preserve 10 days or 5 shifts of vacation leave and not compel them to use that up. But it would be calling for the use of sick, compensatory time, and vacation time, but for the reserved amount. They would still have the ability to use the reserved amount if they wanted to, but they wouldn't be compelled to do so. So that is a policy change. And the city has also made explicit the fact it reserves the right to classify something as FMLA leave, even if the city employee has not specifically requested that. That's called designation. That was always in the law, but it wasn't something we explicitly stated in policy, and it wasn't something that we did as a matter of routine. We think that because of some of the changes we are making in terms of the use of leave, that we'll probably be coming back to you with some other suggested changes in the compensatory leave policy and the sick leave policy to make sure that they all synchronize during this 60-day period. The policy has been the subject of extensive review, consultation, revision with the HR director and assistant director and myself, with input from their staff members who deal with it on a frequent basis, as well as review by the city manager before we brought it to you. And so it does have that support. We don't believe it will have any financial implication for the city. We think it is time and that this should be enough to provide information to employees with letting them know the possibilities, but still having the variations be dealt with by the HR staff and the employee. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions about the law generally or our suggested policy.
Any questions?
I do like the policy situation where you don't force them to take all their leave before, sometimes when you're down, it gets worse. And this will give them an opportunity to not completely let all the sand out of the bottle.
This will mean any leave time doesn't impact their vacation at all?
No.
To a
To a certain,
limit?
just, there's a reserved amount.
They would have to use, in this sequence, they would have to use their sick time first, their compensatory time second, if they are a non-exempt employee and are allowed to keep track of compensatory time, and they've taken that in lieu of having time and a half payments. Obviously, that wouldn't apply to exempt employees. And then vacation. But it would allow them to keep 2 weeks, in essence, of vacation time available. Now, it's a change because the city has not required the use of any of it heretofore, but it is more employee-friendly than almost everybody else that we looked at.
And most employees would use some sort of paid leave because the alternative would be that the time off for FMLA would be unpaid, and that it's difficult to pay bills and so forth. So most were already using some sort of paid leave.
But this does require that it be consecutive, so that you don't have somebody taking 1 hour on Monday that they want as paid FMLA leave, and 2 hours on Wednesday that they want unpaid, and then back and forth if they have a chronic condition that requires them to take intermittent and sporadic leave, because that has proved difficult for tracking purposes. And even with our new ERP software, we discussed at some length whether that was the best way to go, and we believe it is.
Do we need separate motions on A and B?
Separate motions, yes, please.
I'll move for passage on Section A.
Second.
Mr. LaLance and Vice Mayor Young. Ms. Wright, will call the roll.
Mr. Gelly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to address a revision of Section 6012 of the Employee Handbook dealing with information technology resources. This has been a project upon which Adam Tucker, my staff, Chris Lilly, we've involved our consultant Weston to sort of look at it and make sure that they didn't have any different take, and myself to try and gather up in one place what we think are the best practices, and trying to reflect that the city has an interest in keeping its IT system safe, that it be used for productive purposes, and that everyone know who uses it what the rules are to assist in that. We have created a form that we will be having all users sign. This will, they'll be re-signing forms they have previously done, because to reflect these additions, trying to reflect the bring your own device issues, making clear what is and is not a public record, and that there is no expectation of privacy if you're on any part of the city's IT system, and the extent to which it can and cannot be used for personal purposes. That's sort of in summary what the goals are. I'd be happy to answer any specific questions and may well call on Mr. Lilly, since I am not a techno person.
I have a layman question. How big is our employee handbook now?
It's big. One of the things that we have discussed is doing a couple of things. Having a sort of onboarding orientation quickie version that would try and answer the most important issues. We've talked about whether or not we can put it on the intranet to make it more easily available to people, and whether we want to wait and put that in wiki language, which would be easier for people to use. And as Mr. Godwin and I were going to a continuing education thing, we discussed using the intranet to have a series of frequently asked questions about various employee benefits, because the city has issued those as various issues have come up, and we talked about trying to gather them in one place. It's a policy document for department heads, supervisors, and personnel coordinators more now because of the length and breadth of topics it covers. And so having a simpler version, a KISS version, as I tend to call it, is a goal that the city manager has expressed to me and to the HR director, and we've been looking at different ways to achieve that.
Because I know this is 17 pages on our electronic policy, and I would think that however we can make it quicker and easier for an employee to read through, that would be great.
Well, that's why, if you look to the last page, to Form 6012, we really tried to boil it down. As you say, it's one page front and back of the key things, because it's not realistic to expect every employee to go through this. That's what we've done with our ethical standards policy, with our sexual discrimination policy, is to what would you have to know standing on one foot kind of standard. Okay. And that's what that goal of that form is.
Okay. Any other questions?
Move we approve the recommendation.
Second.
Mr. Gilly and Ms. Scales-Harris. Ms. Wright, the call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gales-Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McGinn. We'll consider recommendations of the IT director with regards to IT hardware requests for ERP system upgrade. And you have a updated memo that's on in front of you.
Good evening, Mayor, City Council. In April of 2014, I stood before you requesting approval to select and purchase the Tyler Munis software solution along with Kronos to succeed the city's existing 20-year-old ERP system. The IT department has reviewed the minimum hardware requirements recommended by Tyler Technologies for their Munis product, Kronos and Encode. IT has also discussed the hardware requirements with a few municipalities that currently use the new ERP system. IT has determined that a Blade server solution with a storage area network infrastructure will be the best to support the city's new and robust system. In the agenda, you'll see that there is a total cost of a SAN unit of $231,486.20. There's been a revision to the initial quote of the server network included in the agenda. You have those revisions in front of you. It's at a reduced cost. There's a reduction of $27,913.36, which comes to $203,572.84. If this is approved by the council, funding of this product will be included, has been included in the 2014 CIP. The outlay will be amortized over a 5-year period. The selection of the unit the selection, actually, the purchasing will come through, will be bought through a competitive purchasing agreement called WISCA that we've had approved. I think it was approved several months ago to order through this agreement. I'm open for any questions.
No questions. I just commend you on looking for ways to save money and move to pass it.
Second.
We call this the Chris Griffith rule in reverse, right? Chris Griffith. All right, we have a motion and we have a second. Ms. Wright, you'll call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gales-Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye.
Thank you.
Ms. Wright, do we have any beer permits?
We do. We have a billiard club at 1253 Northwest Broad Street that has met the background requirements and is pending their codes inspections. We have a restaurant at 352 West Northfield Boulevard, Suite 1A. It also is an ownership change that has met our background requirements, and we're waiting for their codes inspections to be complete. There's an ownership change for the restaurant at 1745 Old Fort Parkway. Where it lists there on the form I gave you, that person's not an owner, they're a manager. That is what we typically do for those businesses that are publicly traded. There's really not a way to do the owners in that situation. We are waiting on their codes inspections to be complete, and there is a convenience store at 1600 Memorial Boulevard, another ownership change, and we've got the background check back, and it's complete. We just need the building codes inspections. So if you approve these, what we will do is issue these permits once codes has signed off on them.
Okay, any questions?
I move for approval.
Second.
Ms. Gillis Harris, Mr. Washington. Mr. Wright, will call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. You have a list of statements in front of you that are for payment.
Move to pay the bills, Mayor.
Second.
Mr. Gilly, Mr. Young, Ms. Wright, will call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance.
Aye.
Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. You have a list of recommended appointments or reappointments. Ms. McGannon, I read these last meeting. Do I need to go through and read those again this meeting? Okay,
I think
yes.
Ms. Machota would be happier
I'm going
if
to
you
keep
did.
asking that at least for the next 4 years, so that way Ms. Machota will have to cough at me to make sure and tell me yes. Is that okay, Ms. Machota? All right. We're recommending to reappoint to the Cable Television Commission Mr. Ronald Lindsay and Robert Maxey. Recommending for the Old Fort Golf Commission reappointments of Bill Allen, John Blankenship, Alan Richardson, Don Turner, and Larry Wilkerson. For the Greenway Projects Committee, recommending reappointment of Dan Charley and Martin McCullough. Parks and Recreation Commission recommending the reappointment of Linda Gilbert and Eddie Miller. To the Risk Management Committee, we're recommending Lee Moss and also Rob Lyons. And if y'all need to set that aside to decide whether you want to do that or not. For the Urban Environmental Commission, reappointments of John Duke, George Hanson, and Linda Roberts. The Water and Sewer Board, I'm going to hold off on the Water and Sewer Board until the next meeting. And then the Senior Center Commission, Jim Getzinger and J.D. Kennedy. And those are all for reappointments. Please.
Move to approve.
Second.
Ms. Wright, will call the roll.
Mr. Gilly.
Aye.
Ms. Gels Harris.
Aye.
Mr. LaLance. Mr. Smotherman.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Young.
Aye.
Mayor McFarland.
Aye. And then also you'll have on your desk for our next meeting a recommended appointment to the Cable Commission, and that would be the school board representative Phil King to replace the chairman, Mary Wade. Do we have any other business from staff? Council members, any other business?
I think we're repaving every road in Murfreesboro right now, so we look forward to seeing some asphalt get put down in the next couple of weeks.
Make hay while you can, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Seeing none, we'll stand adjourned.